Mormon culture made the company Crumbl, and I fully believe that this would not exist if Joseph Smith didn't pen the Word of Wisdom as scripture back in 1833. The Word of Wisdom, which is the Mormon health code, has had a huge impact on Utah's food and beverage scene. Crumbl was started by two Mormon men, they both served missions, and they're both from Utah, so this company is basically as Mormon as you can get. No video about Crumbl would be complete without me doing a mini taste test. And of course, there are many locations of Crumbl really close to me, even though I live in Texas, I don't live in Utah, but this was about 15 minutes from my house. You know what would go really well with this? Coffee. They're really not half bad. I got the 4-pack. You can get them in 8-packs or the mini kind. You can see I took a video as I was ordering off to the side here. It's such a shame because this with coffee is really an amazing combination, so what a waste. Crumbl cookies are between 700 to 800 calories per cookie, and so that means that if all of the cookies in my box were 700 calories, that would be about 2,800 calories if I were to eat the entire box. Whenever I went into this Crumbl cookie location, I was looking around because I kind of wanted to figure out who owns the franchise. Crumbl, which we'll get into in a bit, is a franchise, so that means that most of the locations that you see, you know, anyone listening to this, there's a Crumbl location in all 50 states, so you might have come across one. And those are mostly owned by franchisees. So they're not just directly owned by the people who started the company, they're owned by the people who chose to franchise the brand, Crumbl, and open their own independent location. And so my location, I just wanted to figure out if my location is owned by Mormons. I live in Texas, but there's still a lot of Mormons in Texas. So I looked up the name I saw in the business disclosure, I found their Instagram, and in this picture, you can see that they are sending their parents on a Mormon mission. So I've talked a lot about when I was a young person, I went on a Mormon mission, but there's also senior missionaries, so often retirement age people will go on missions. So anyways, all that to say, there is clear evidence on this person's Instagram that they are Mormon, which means that my location of Crumbl Cookie was franchised out by Mormons in Texas. Now, the reason I say that Crumbl is such a Mormon company is not just because the founders are Mormon, but also because the reason that the sweet treats industry in Utah is massive, and the soda industry is massive, is that Mormons cannot have coffee. This is the devil's bean juice. This is considered against the Word of Wisdom. And so in Utah, if you ever head to Utah, if you're ever driving around the interstate, you'll see more soda shops. Dirty soda is, well, I'll talk about that in a bit. You'll see more soda shops than coffee shops, which anywhere else in the country, you're gonna see a coffee shop on every corner. And it's not like there's no coffee shops in Utah, but there's far more soda shops. There's lots of different iterations of soda shops. And the extension of that is that cookies are also ultra popular in Utah. I think the simplest explanation for 700 calorie cookies and 44 ounce Diet Dr. Peppers is that when you take away vices like coffee, like tobacco, which is also against the Word of Wisdom, you create a void that people will still have a need to fill. And the way that Mormons fill that coffee flavored void that Joseph Smith left in their lives is that they drink a ton of soda. A ton of energy drinks are very common to find, you know, in Utah you'll see Monster is really popular. Last week I did my reaction to The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives Season 2, so check that out after this one if you haven't. But all of them are always drinking Swig, they're drinking Monster, they're drinking energy drinks. And so because of this health code, which is kind of a misnomer because what health code is allowing you to down 44 ounces of soda and eat these crazy cookies. So it's not really a health code, even though that's what Mormons call it. It's more of like a rule book to follow of random, you know, don't have this, do have this. You can't have green tea is another thing, which in what world is green tea more unhealthy than these massive cookies? I don't know. So it's kind of nonsensical, but I'll explain more in a bit about where the Word of Wisdom came from and what inspired Joseph Smith to write it. And so this video is going to be a a deep dive into the Mormon origins of Crumbl. I'll talk a little bit more about Crumbl's founders. We'll also jump into the Cookie Wars, the Utah Cookie Wars, which was between Crumbl and the Dirty Dough and one other cookie company, and why it's so common to see copycat companies popping up around Utah. In a quote from this article by a woman named Reagan Young, she says, "Every time I see more sugar places pop up, I think, oh no, they don't know what they're getting into," Young said. "There's a lot of competition, donut, cookie, and dessert places in general. The Utah economy just can't handle it. In the Riverton area, it's very saturated. You've got Crumbl on every corner, Chip, Crave, Dirty Dough, Wanison as well. It's too saturated." I also love seeing how Utah shows up on Google Trends. You can basically plug a word into Google Trends and it will show search volume. It will show what states are searching more for different things. So it's a really interesting tool to play around with. And guess in your brain what the word cookie, how does Utah rank among the 50 states for the word cookie? If you guessed number 2, you would be correct. So in the last 5 years, Utah had the number 2 search volume for the word cookie. I figured I'd compare that with coffee, since as I already said, coffee is against the word of wisdom and it's considered a sin. And coffee, amongst all 50 states, the search volume for coffee is number 47 over the last 5 years. So cookie is all the way at the top and coffee is all the way at the bottom. We've also got soda for number 2 in Utah, and Idaho is number 1 for soda, which is hilarious because Idaho is part of the Mormon corridor. It's basically Idaho, Utah, Arizona all of those states have really high populations of Mormons. Sugar is also number 2 and chocolate is also number 2 for Utah. So if there's one state that definitely has a sweet tooth, it's Utah. One of the reasons that Crumbl became so massive is that they do a ton of sponsorships. They're very viral online. They have a new set of cookies every week, so there's always new flavors cycling through, and it kind of creates this fear of missing out and a sense of scarcity because every week there's a new cookie to try, and you're not, this is your one opportunity to get the Halloween cookie or the Christmas cookie or whatever. And they also do a lot of sponsorships with very, very big celebrities. So for example, some recent famous sponsorships, Olivia Rodrigo made a Guts cookie. Kylie Jenner did a cookie thing with Crumbl for Kylie Cosmetics. We did a whole menu takeover by the Jenner family, so kind of continuing with the whole Kylie Jenner sponsorship. We also had the Jonas Brothers, all did collaborations in some sense with Crumbl, and that's just what seems to be their sponsored collaborations. Aside from that, a ton of different celebrities have just chosen to review them, or influencers review them often, and so whether it's celebrity sponsorships or viral reviews, they're just everywhere online. Crumbl was founded in Utah in 2017, which is less than 10 years ago, but they are already exploring, according to this article, a $2 billion sale, so they've grown and scaled incredibly quickly. Also, to be clear, they in no way sponsored me to make this video. I think I would alienate their target demographic as an outspoken ex-Mormon, so I just wanted to also state that, so just to be totally clear, they did not sponsor me to make this video. Before we continue, just a quick reminder to like this video, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I have a new video about Mormon culture, Mormon doctrine, the history of the church, my experience in the church, a new video every single week, so consider subscribing and hitting the bell button so you get some notifications for whenever I post. If you've tried Crumbl yourself, please drop your experience below, and if there's any other Mormon-y type companies that you can think of that I didn't add to my list, feel free to drop them in the comments as well. One thing I was thinking about as I was preparing to make this video is that when people find out that Crumbl was founded by Mormons, they seem pretty surprised and kind of like shocked that a company founded by people who are of this kind of quirky random religion could reach such a broad and massive audience. And it made me think of other companies that are founded for Mormons by Mormons that people often end up brushing up against, because while Mormons are the target audience, or Mormons are the founders, or Utah, all of these companies started in Utah, they often can be somewhat useful to the broader public. So an example of a company like this, which was made for the Mormon ecosystem of customers, is a brand or company called Clearplay. And I have watched many a movie on Clearplay. What Clearplay does is it basically edits out swear words, inappropriate scenes, violence, you know, what basically as you go into Clearplay, you can toggle what you want to see and what you don't want to see. It's kind of hilarious to watch content this way because unfortunately often during the most heated scenes, you get a lot of plot points. So you'll be watching some movie and suddenly it'll just skip forward and you completely lose the plot because during the intimate relationship scene or during the violent scene, they were talking to each other and, you know, they're like, so and so is my cousin, or, you know, I have the gold in the bag. And you just miss the really important plot points that were discussed or came out during the questionable scene. And so, you know, some movies, it's like the movie will be 2 hours and then it's shortened down to 45 minutes because there's so much questionable content. So anyways, Clearplay was made by Mormon brothers, and because Mormons can't watch R-rated movies, and most movies made for adults are rated R, this was basically a way for them to make it so that Mormons could still watch different types of content and just know in their hearts that they are not going to be exposed to questionable R-rated material. Another company like this is VidAngel. It does essentially the same thing, and VidAngel was also founded by Mormons. I've also talked quite a bit about how Mormons, most worthy Mormon adults, wear something called garments. It's religious underwear. It has special markings on it. This is an example of garments. I recently did a video about garments, like a deep dive if you want to go see them. So basically garments look like this. They're just like a white undershirt and you can see the marks. But garments often make it very difficult to dress because they poke out. So you're supposed to wear these under your pajamas and you're supposed to wear these under your day-to-day clothing. So you basically wear them 24/7 with a few exceptions like showering. So these create an issue for women, especially because it's often very difficult to find clothing that you can wear while you have this underneath it because the garments will be poking out of your clothing. I have a picture here where you can see that it's poking out of my collar. So this looks the same, but it's not garments. It's called a Wonder Tee. You can see it advertised here. And the purpose of the Wonder Tee is to be fitted to exactly cover the garment. And so while I would be heretical for showing the garments, I would not be considered heretical for having an identical white shirt over the top. And so that's how we get a Mormon-founded company like DownEast Basics, because they are trying to invent a solution to what is exclusively a Mormon problem. However, I will say in some comments I've received that people say that they're not Mormon, they've never been Mormon, but they would wear stuff like this because it has functionality outside of just covering the garment, because it's a form-fitting shirt that fits well. It's like kind of like a tank top that fits underneath your clothing. So people have told me that they wear these shade tees or Wonder Tees even though they're not Mormon and they don't wear garments and they've never needed to cover their sacred religious underwear. Another example of this that I've already mentioned is soda shops. We have Swig, So Delicious, Quench, Thirst. I feel like there's 1,000 of them. I don't even know if we've tracked all of the soda shops that exist in one place. I did drink Swig. This is the same cup from last week. I drank Swig during my Secret Lives reaction, and during Secret Lives, they're all drinking dirty soda. It's not actually dirty. Usually it's some sort of Diet Coke, Diet Dr. Pepper. It doesn't have to be diet. It can be regular, but they like it without sugar. And then they do mix in. So it's like some lime or lemon or half and half or coconut cream. And it's basically kind of like a mocktail. And it serves as a fun substitute for coffee. I think, you know, the experience of getting coffee is actually really fun. Go to the coffee shop, sit down, chat, work on your computer. And so there's a whole coffee shop culture that the Mormon church and Mormons are just completely missing out on. But I think that Swig is essentially their substitute. So at BYU, when I went there, people would often walk to go to So Delicious. You'd sit outside on the picnic tables, you drink your dirty soda, and you would chat. Another example of businesses that serve the Mormon ecosystem that a lot of people that have never been Mormon are familiar with is Family Search. So this is actually founded by the Mormon Church, not founded by Mormons. It's founded by the church specifically. And that's because in Mormon temples, a lot of what you do is you're doing baptisms for the dead. so that in the afterlife, the soul of the passed away person can accept the Mormon baptism, because only Mormons get into the highest level of Mormon heaven. And so Mormons in Mormon temples baptize by proxy the souls of the dead. I know it's not sounding great. And then they also do washing and anointing ceremonies. They do temple sealing marriage ceremonies. So all of these are ceremonies that take place in Mormon temples. And most of what happens is in the name of, or for and behalf of, people who have passed on. So we're getting there. So they have to do a lot of genealogy so that they can find the names of those who have passed on. And I have a whole video about it. They received a ton of criticism, rightly deserved criticism, for baptizing a lot of people who passed away in the Holocaust, for example, including Anne Frank. The Catholic Church, for example, said that they were no longer sharing any of their genealogical information with the Mormon Church, because with a site like Family Search, it sounds so nice because you can go on, you can see your ancestors, and that's something a lot of people are really genuinely interested in. But the problem is that they're often using that information to then go and baptize those people, which, when an organization like the Catholic Church is providing these genealogical records, they didn't necessarily seem to fully know what was going to be done with that information. And so the Catholic Church rescinded the choice to give those people their genealogical information. And so obviously these people were Catholic. That's why the Catholic Church has their information. And so for the Mormon Church to take this information and then to be baptizing these people posthumously to be Mormon is obviously not what the Catholic Church thought was going to be done with this information. And so I've met a lot of people who are familiar with Family Search and have enjoyed using Family Search because you can make an account whether you're Mormon or not. And then they're like, oh, is this what this information is for? Oh my God. So that's another example of a company that was founded within the Mormon ecosystem that reaches a broad level of usage that sometimes people are surprised to hear why this company started to begin with. So I wanted to give a little bit more background to the Word of Wisdom, which I mentioned at the beginning is what Joseph Smith wrote, and is now why Mormons don't drink coffee. The Word of Wisdom comes from the Doctrine and Covenants. Most of you are probably already familiar with the Book of Mormon, which is where Mormons get their nickname. The correct name of the church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Mormons is much quicker and easier to say. And so the Word of Wisdom does not come from the Book of Mormon. It actually comes from the Doctrine and Covenants. And these are the scriptures I had when I was still Mormon. You can see off to the side here, it's a little worn on mine, but it's the Bible, the New and Old Testament, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. The Doctrine and Covenants are essentially a compilation of Joseph Smith's early revelations concerning the foundation of the church. So it's a lot of early church history. A lot of it is instruction for the earliest members of the Mormon Church, and that is where we find the Word of Wisdom. The Doctrine and Covenants is found in chapter 89, and ironically, the word coffee never surfaces in this section. Instead, we get verse 9, which says, "And again, hot drinks are not for the body or belly." So hot drinks is taken to mean coffee. I wrote to the side, you can see in my note here, coffee and tea. So a lot of people have said, well, can I have iced coffee? Because, of course, you would think that. Unfortunately, because of the evolution of this doctrine over time, it's come to mean coffee specifically, not the fact that it's hot, even though hot drinks is what shows up in the verse. And so you can't have iced coffee, you can't have hot coffee. In my family, we wouldn't call it a coffee table, we wouldn't have coffee cake. The word coffee was like, it's kind of like avoiding the appearance of evil. Anything with coffee in it is just completely off limits. But we were allowed to have hot chocolate, which is hot. So it's very nonsensical. It's so funny to see people try to make rhyme or reason of the Word of Wisdom and be like, well, why can I have this but not that, or this, you know, what's the logical reasoning behind this? And there is none, because it's a made-up religion. An example of that is that Mormons don't drink wine, even for communion. For communion in Mormonism, they call it the sacrament. It's just water and bread. So you'll never see wine as part of even Mormon sacrament. Mormons don't drink wine. There's no alcohol allowed, which is ironic, once again, again, considering that the word of wisdom actually does specifically address how Mormons should approach wine. It says, that inasmuch as any man drinketh wine or strong drink among you, behold, it is not good, neither meet in the sight of your Father, only in assembling yourselves together to offer up your sacraments before him, and behold, this should be wine, yea, pure wine of the grape of the vine of your own make. And I literally have a little question mark next to that, because as you can tell, I spent a lot of time annotating my scriptures, and I think it's so funny that I put a little question mark, because I don't understand if this is part of the word of wisdom that we should have basically what seems to be homemade wine as our communion, which means sacrament. I don't get why we don't do that, because it's in the thing he wrote. I don't get it. I'll also link this whole thing below, because it is really interesting to read through and just see what it is that he's saying about meat or wine or strong drinks or hot drinks, so if you want to read all the words, I'll link it below. Another example of this shows up in verse 12, which says, yea, flesh also of beasts and of the fowls of the air, I the Lord have ordained for the use of man with thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly. And it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or of cold or of famine. So once again, if you take that literally, which I guess we're not supposed to do, you're supposed to have meat sparingly, and really mostly only in winter or during famine. And so that to me is hilarious, because eating meat sparingly is thrown out the door by Mormons. They love steak, they love hamburgers. It also mentions fowls of the air. They eat, whatever form of chicken wings, fried chicken sandwiches. There's no part of Mormon culture that is attempting to follow this part of the word of wisdom, which is to eat meat sparingly. And yet we still have this very, very strict understanding of coffee being a total sin. And even according to this speech given by a Mormon leader, this woman had a habit of drinking coffee, and as a result, all of her children left the Mormon church, and she lost her eternal family. And so the stakes for even coffee, they're very high stakes, but there's a lot of the stakes because they're not eating meat sparingly. That's also why I say it's ironic they call it the health code, because if it truly was a health code, you would not see Mormons slamming down multiple monsters, 700-calorie cookies. Some of these cookies are over 1,000 calories. And so the idea that Mormons are like patting themselves on the back for having a health code and then engaging in what is obviously not necessarily very healthy behaviors just makes them human. No shade necessarily, but don't say you have a health code if you're just kind of you're still living a life that isn't particularly, founded in ultra health like you might think when you hear health code. Unsurprisingly, the word sugar also never appears in the word of wisdom. Not sure that was necessarily super top of mind in 1830s when Joseph Smith was writing this, but there's no prohibition against sugar. And even for coffee specifically, coffee was not taken very seriously by the church. Early saints would drink coffee. Brigham Young drank alcohol. This really wasn't taken very seriously until they added the word of wisdom to the temple questions in the early 1900s. And so prior to that, it was basically like, hey, it's not a great idea to drink too much, or hey, don't drink too hot of drinks, I guess. But at a certain point, they decided to add it to the temple recommend questions, which meant that if you were drinking coffee, you couldn't get into the temple. And if you can't get in the temple, you can't get married for time and all eternity, and you can't get your endowment ceremony, you can't get the washing and anointing, and without those three things, you can't enter the highest level of Mormon heaven. And so essentially, by adding coffee and the word of wisdom to the temple recommend questions, this was part of now the new gatekeeping method to keep people out of the highest level of the celestial kingdom. And so it became something that people really doubled down on and became much more serious and a much larger part of the culture. And so the modern interpretation of the word of wisdom is, like I said, no coffee, but caffeine is okay. So growing up, I wasn't allowed to have caffeine. Most devout Mormons didn't have caffeine growing up, but the church clarified their stance when Mitt Romney was running for office, because Mitt Romney was photographed with caffeinated soda, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe Mitt Romney did that. And then the church released a statement saying that caffeine is okay, but it's the coffee that's not okay. And it's so funny because you can find articles like this which refer to the church's statement, but the church has removed the statement from their website. So if you try to follow any of these articles through and go to the actual statement, they've removed it from their website, which they do all the time. It's very sneaky. They'll put something out there and then they'll take it back. And then, you can find vestiges of it, like mentions of things in articles by other organizations, but they'll just take stuff down, and it gaslights the members into feeling like these things never happened because they just remove it. And even though the church released that statement in response to the Mitt Romney Gate situation, BYU didn't have caffeine on campus till 2017. So I existed my entire college years without any caffeine, which is kind of remarkable to me that I was waking up early and staying up late without having some caffeine. But so even though they kind of were clarifying the doctrine, they didn't have any Coca-Cola, for example, or Dr. Pepper available on BYU campus all the way till 2017. And so I think that's another remnant of proof that caffeine was really seen as not being okay until very recently in the church. Despite getting rid of the caffeine rule, BYU, though, still does not allow men to grow beards, which is another story entirely. Like I said, there's no iced coffee allowed, no black or green tea is allowed, but herbal tea is okay, but matcha, which comes from green tea, is not okay. There's also no iced tea along with the iced coffee, so you can't say, oh, hot drinks are not okay, so I'll have iced green tea. That would also be a no-no. There's also something called kava kava, which has become more popular more recently, but it's something that's more popular in Pacific Islander culture, and that's a bit of a gray area because people will say it's too similar to coffee, or the characteristics, I think it makes you more sleepy. I've really never tried kava kava, but I've seen it brought up as on forums and stuff of people being like, is kava kava okay? And it's so funny because the word of wisdom is so nonsensical that it leads to a lot of Googling, and people will be like, can I have kava kava? Can I have this iced? Can I have this hot? And instead of just knowing, even Mormons who have been devout for their entire lives will have to still be looking certain things up. Like I remember when I was a member, someone offered me a chai latte, and I was like, latte, that sounds like coffee, but it says chai. And so I was sitting there Googling, after a lifetime of growing up in the church, can Mormons have chai? The answer was no, because it's just so, there's so many different types of substances and it's really hard to keep track of. Unsurprisingly, Crumbl has never released a coffee flavored cookie, and I saw in a Reddit thread that apparently one of the founders was getting upset that people were suggesting that they have coffee flavored cookies and was like, don't bring that up again, which is kind of hilarious. So they do not have any coffee flavored options at all. Another ironic thing about this, and obviously like I said last week in my Secret Lives of Mormon Wives reaction, they go do ketamine therapy. You would expect that if you can't have coffee, you can't do ketamine therapy, but anything that's prescribed by a doctor is considered okay. This even extends to medicinal cannabis. Anything that a doctor says gives you the thumbs up on, you could still get a temple recommend. You're not going to face a lot of scrutiny from members. So, it is very strange that you can get strong opioid medicine or really any medicine that is prescribed by a doctor, but you can't have coffee. I also think another interesting part of the word of wisdom is that different family cultures will respond to the word of wisdom differently. So I knew a family who would cook with cooking wine, for example. So the alcohol cooks out, so they say. So when they were cooking, they'd have some cooking red wine or something in their cabinet. They would use the red wine, they would heat it up, cook whatever they were cooking, and then their family, that was considered to be okay. In my family, though, we never had anything like that. That was totally off limits. Another example is vanilla. So real vanilla that you would bake with is made with alcohol. So some families would only ever use imitation vanilla because under their understanding of the word of wisdom, cooking with vanilla that was, pure vanilla made with alcohol was breaking the word of wisdom. And so different families have these ideas of how the word of wisdom is meant to be lived, passed down within their own family cultures. And it's very interesting that even Mormon to Mormon, there are disagreements with how Joseph Smith would have wanted us to interact with these substances. As I said earlier, removing these vices from Mormon culture creates a cookie-sized hole, and what fills the void is sugar. And whenever your mind goes to, I want a drink, I want a cocktail, I want a coffee, I want a vape, the Mormon mind goes to sugar. Speaking of the Mormon Church, if you haven't already considered checking out my book, How to Leave the Mormon Church, An Ex-Mormon's Guide to Rebuilding After Religion. I actually wrote this book before I even ever started a social media channel. This was my first foray into talking about my experiences with the church and trying to reach other people who were looking for support as they left the Mormon Church. Here are some of the reviews for the book. I'll link it below if you want to check it out. A lot of the book is a guide for people looking to answer questions like, how do I tell my family I'm leaving the church? How do I try coffee for the first time? How do I get comfortable in my body and try wearing a tank top for the first time? Or, learn more about my sexuality. I have chapters on everything I could think of that I learned as I was leaving the church. I also include a lot of personal stories. For example, I have a story about what it was like for me to try drinking for the first time. And so if you were never Mormon, but you also just want to learn more about my story, consider checking out my book. To quote from this article, this is a quote directly from one of the founders of Crumbl. He said, "We knew that Utah was very bakery driven. It's the Mormon culture," Hemsley says. "We have our fair share of vices, but they're not necessarily drugs or alcohol. It's sugar and soda. We're used to sharing baked goods with our neighbors." And so growing up, anytime we'd be at a church function, often the church function would end with some sort of sweet treat. I remember when I went to a Christian church once, it was one of those big mega Christian churches, and they had a coffee shop in the church, and I just remember being like, coffee in the church? Jesus is gonna be turning over tables when he gets in here. But we also had something called Family Home Evening, and as part of Family Home Evening, which we did every Monday night, there'd be a little lesson about Mormon teachings of some kind. We'd sing some songs, we'd say prayers, and at the end of Family Home Evening, we would always have some sort of sweet treat, whether it was brownies or lemon bars or ice cream. That was like the most exciting part of Family Home Evening, was that we got some sugar at the end of it. I also think it was funny that in Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, we see in season 1, Whitney's mom is baking brownies for all of them as they're sitting and talking. In season 2, we see the Mormon Bake Off, and I always think that that Mormon moms who are making baked goods all the time is like the Mormon version of a wine mom, because the wine moms love their wine and the Mormon wine moms love their baked goods. And so when you have something like the word of wisdom, it pretty directly shapes a culture. And just like how in Texas, there's cowboy boots and cowboy hats all over the place, and in California, there's a ton of surf shops. In Utah, it's all about the soda shops and Mormon culture and the religion shaping the culture, rather than just some of these more secular things that shape culture in other places. And so that's why, in my opinion, because Joseph Smith was chatting with God all the time, that's how we get our pink Crumbl cookie boxes that are now available in all 50 states. Now let's talk a little bit more about the founding of Crumbl. As I said, it started in 2017, started by 2 Mormon men living in Utah. As of August 2024, the company has 1,071 locations in all 50 states and some in other countries as well. It seems like what really tipped them off is that during COVID, during the pandemic, people were mostly staying at home. It's mostly a pickup only business. So you go pick up the cookies and you go, or you get them dropped off. So it's back when everybody was really focused on social distancing and wearing masks and not going into businesses, and they were staying at home and they wanted a pick me up and they wanted a sweet treat. So during the pandemic, it seems like that's when the business really took off. Another reason that Crumbl was able to grow so quickly is because of franchising. So some companies, like for example, In-N-Out, which is another restaurant. All of the locations are centrally owned. So basically the company goes out, they scout out a spot, they build it, and it's just centrally held. So there's not some individual that is going to In-N-Out and saying, hey, I want to start a franchise of your company. And then In-N-Out is like, okay, if you pay me $500,000, we'll let you do that. And you can use our marketing materials, you can use our branding. And so the $500,000 goes basically towards buying into the brand so that you can start your own location. In-N-Out, though, is just centrally held. They're not a franchise. So the company decides to open a location and the company opens the location. It's not independently held by an individual. Whereas for Crumbl, a family or an individual would go to Crumbl and say, I want to buy into your franchise. They would give them the license and then they would go open that location. According to this article, it says, as of January 2022, there are 344 Crumbl stores in 42 different states, and about a dozen of them are owned by Lori Hemsley, her husband Lance, and or Sawyer's 3 siblings. Needless to say, Sawyer Hemsley's family and friends, several of his old college roommates from USU, also own franchises, came around to embrace the idea of a tech-driven bakery. And so the reason I wanted to highlight that quote is first that Sawyer Hemsley is one of the founders. We'll talk more about him in a bit, but also just to show that the reason it's able to grow so quickly is not that this person, Sawyer Hemsley, is having to go out and scout out locations and open the store. He's basically having other people decide, wow, this is a really great idea. I want to own a piece of this. And they go help him grow his brand by starting a location themselves. As I said, this is one of the reasons why Crumbl was able to grow so quickly, is that people were willing to raise their hand and say, hey, I want to open a location, and they're willing to buy in. And as I said, in my opinion, and according to this quote, and from what a lot of people have said, a lot of these franchises across all 50 states are owned by Mormons. And so because Crumbl is a Mormon-founded company with a Mormon-friendly product, and there's a lot of hype around Crumbl, obviously with all these viral videos, a lot of Mormon families are seeing this success and saying, wow, you know, this company represents in many ways our values. They're always closed on Sunday too. I don't know if I mentioned that. And so while it might be hard for just some random person to grow a cookie company this quickly, because it's Mormon, other Mormons are more easily brought on board, kind of like the MLM video I did, to say, we'll also put our own investment into this and we'll help it grow more quickly. As I said, one of the founders is Sawyer Hemsley and the other is Jason McGowan. I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive into both of them because I think their two personas online and what they've said and who they are is actually pretty interesting to get into. Sawyer Hemsley grew up in Idaho, he went to Utah State, and he served his Mormon mission in Mexico. And so this means he's basically just about as Mormon as you can be, being from Utah, serving a mission, college in Utah. This also means he, at one point, did the temple endowment ceremony. He said he would wear the garments, that kind of a thing. His social media presence is very interesting, though, because he doesn't give off really, really strong Mormon vibes, in my opinion. I would say he no longer seems like he's devoutly practicing, but he's still quite a cultural Mormon. For example, he has a huge house he's building in Utah, but there's no photos of the temple, there's no photos of Jesus. And so to read between the Mormon to ex-Mormon lines, I would say that he's more out of the church than in it. Another thing that's interesting that I noticed about his account, which this is something I often do when I'm kind of internet stalking someone, is I go see who they follow, because I think that's an interesting way of seeing a little bit about who they are, who they're finding interesting. So one thing I noticed is that we have a lot of similar people we follow, and a lot of the people on this list are ex-Mormons. And so while Sawyer Hemsley is not an outspoken ex-Mormon, he is choosing to follow a lot of different accounts that are Mormon. I also searched to find if he followed the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint accounts, and he doesn't follow any of the church's official accounts. And if we contrast that with Jason McGowan, who is the other founder, who we see here, he is a dad of 7, and if you go to see who he's following, you can see he's following some of the church's accounts. Now, the reason that I thought that this was interesting as I was doing this research, first of all, I obviously just have some ex-Mormon solidarity, but mostly that I was thinking about why someone who is about to sell a company valued potentially $2 billion, might not be as outspoken about being out of the church. This is just my personal theory, which is that when you have all these franchises, so keep in mind, all of these Crumbl locations are not independently held. They've licensed their brand out to franchisees, and then as the franchise is making money, a certain percentage of that goes back to Crumbl. So who's opening these franchises? As I said, it's mostly Mormons who are excited about the brand and excited about its virality and think it's a good idea. And so even though he may very well have a $2 billion brand here, a lot of the reason the brand currently is successful is not just because of him, it's because of the Mormons who have chosen to be part of the franchise and who are helping him with his business. And so if suddenly he is an outspoken exmo, it may become more difficult to maintain this Mormon image and favorability with all the people who have chosen to franchise with him. And so the level of quiet, maybe it's just because he doesn't want to talk about it, which is totally fine too. And maybe he is a very devout Mormon. Like I said, this is all conjecture. This is all theory. This is just my brain. But when I see potentially that someone might not be as in the church, but that their business is still mostly in the church, this is really common. They keep up appearances because whether you live in Utah or even BYU professors, I think they don't believe they don't really want to be in the church anymore. And yet their identity and their profession and the way they make money is based off of their continuing in the church. And so I think it puts a lot of people in between a rock and a hard place because they have to navigate between staying quiet and maintaining their friends, their job, their income, their place in society, and everything they've done to build up what that is to be a cultural Mormon, and being honest with who they are and what they believe and burning everything to the ground. And so I kind of have a theory, like I said, a theory that potentially if Crumbl sells, we may see Sawyer Hemsley be a little bit more outspoken with who he is or whether he's in the church or not, because once it sells, then he gets the payday and then, he's not really beholden to these franchisees who are expecting him to uphold this squeaky clean Mormon image. And I think that this choice to navigate between these two questions is very common. As I said, I've seen a lot of people who, after they graduate from BYU, they will post their graduation photo, they'll post themselves with a rainbow flag, and they'll say, I'm leaving the church and I'm coming out as gay or lesbian or trans or LGBTQ in some way. And I think that, at BYU specifically, there's fear of getting expelled for admitting, for being who you are and for being open about that kind of a thing. And so I think that the church really teaches people to, very cruelly teaches people to hide parts of themselves that are not favorable or don't match the Mormon mold, because once you stick your head above that line, you could be punished by the church. You could be punished because your friends won't talk to you anymore. You could be kicked out of your university. You could lose your job because your Mormon boss expects you to be following the Mormon rules. And so it's really sad to see people try to hide or tamp down parts of themselves. And it's a reason, honestly, I wanted to move out of Utah so that, when I go to the grocery store and I have my nose ring, it's not like people are like, I can tell she's not Mormon. People in Texas are just like, here we are shopping. And it feels like a lot of those choices in Utah are taken, like they're calculating your Mormonness. Whereas in the rest of the United States and world, it's just like people are existing more, at least. Obviously, people judge you for what you look like no matter where you go. But I appreciate and I enjoy being removed from such a Mormon context because I don't feel like on a day-to-day basis, I'm brushing up against this analysis of, is she wearing garments? She has tattoos. Okay, like, is she Mormon? Is she not? I feel like in Utah, there's a never-ending calculus that seems to be going on in people's minds. And I really appreciate that in everywhere else I've ever lived, it just doesn't feel like you're brushing up against that every day. Like I said, one of the reasons Crumbl has become so popular is because of how viral it's been online. I also think some part of the secret sauce of Mormon companies growing so quickly is that they have that initial initial Mormon niche that they're able to sell to. And then once they get their kind of initial seed fund, they can grow to a broader audience. And this is the same theory I shared in my video, my theory why there are so many Mormon influencers, which is that their initial following is very niched into Mormons. And then once they get their initial following, once they get, they're posting conference talks and they're putting Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in their bio. And then once they get a larger following, many people have noted that a lot of these influencers become less and less Mormon in their online presence as they get bigger. So while they'll start very niched into Mormons specifically, as they grow, they just become more consumable by a broader, more global, more national audience. So for example, this is a blog that is still up. I'll link it below. It's from Ballerina Farm. And she talks she talks a lot about Mormon stuff. Like she talks about conference talks. She talks about the temple or going to the temple. The entire vibe of the blog is just early 2000s Mormon mom blogger. And it really doesn't resemble what she's posting online now. But I really think that if Mormons can start their businesses, whether it's Swig or if it's Crumbl or if it's your influencer brand, if they can start by appealing to this pretty big audience in Utah, but just be appealing to Mormons in their little ecosystem. Once they get 50,000, 100,000 plus followers, once they get 10 locations, or, once they've grown to be a certain size, then scaling that becomes much more simple. I also think an interesting thing to note about Crumbl's advertising presence is that it seems like they're kind of taking the approach that no press is bad press, because some of the most viral videos of Crumbl are people saying they don't taste good. I feel like they taste, like I said, fine. I mean, it's just a sugar cookie. I'm not like gonna run to Crumbl to get the new cookies of every week after this video. I'm not hooked. I wouldn't say they're disgusting though. I've seen some reviews that are just like, which fine. I don't know. You can think whatever you want about cookies, obviously, but I do think it's so interesting that Crumbl seems to be using the same strategy as the church, which the Mormon church I think also has this idea that no press is bad press. It reminds me of this comment that was recently in one of my videos. And just to read the beginning of it, it says, "It's almost ironic. Your efforts to tear down the church may have actually brought more people into it. I'd be willing to bet you've inspired more curiosity than rejection." To move forward a bit, it says, "It's well known that negative press can have as much impact as positive, sometimes more. So even though you've chosen to walk away, you're still playing a role, still contributing. In a roundabout way, you're a great asset to the church, and in your own way, you're doing important work. Keep it up." And it has 23 replies, which is so funny because, if L. Gibbons really thinks that, and if the church really thinks that, maybe they should play my video about the Book of Abraham or about the Book of Mormon, just play it in sacrament meeting. Maybe they should play it for the youth. If it's really just doing really positive work for the church, show it to every member every Sunday. I have a new video every week. Subscribe if you haven't already. Just show, every Sunday you can show my new video. And I've seen people say this too about the CES letter, which is a common document that debunks Mormonism pretty thoroughly, and I'll link that below too. But people will be like, the CES letter strengthened my testimony, which is like, well, if it so strengthens your testimony and your belief in the church, why not share it to every member? Why not post it on Facebook? Why not share it on your Instagram? Probably because it's actually not faith promoting. Probably because if I was actually, quote, a great asset to the church, they would be sharing my videos and I would see members commenting really happy, positive things rather than hateful things a lot more than I do. And so to me, I think Crumbl is also basically aware of the same phenomenon or carrying the same idea with them, which is that if there's a viral video with their cookies in it, it's a win, whether that person is saying they tasted good or saying they tasted like dog shit. I also think it's interesting that Crumbl has been at the center of more lawsuits than I expected, which is also what I found when I did my MLM video, is that all of these MLMs have some sort of warning letter from the FDA or some class action lawsuit. All of them seem to have some level of controversy attached to them. For Crumbl, they were sued by Warner Music Group for using their music. They have had several child labor law violations, several locations involving 46 workers, which is like children, so I don't know why they're referring to them as workers. They also have all the litigation associated with the cookie wars, which I'm about to get into. And I don't know what it is with these Utah companies. Maybe I'm just seeing more lawsuits because I'm looking into these companies, and maybe all companies have lawsuits. But my own theory for this is that often when a company is scaling, I mean, we already saw, I don't know if it would be legally considered nepotism, but when you see that one of the reasons Crumbl was able to grow so quickly is that all of the family started buying franchises and helping them expand. I think that maybe sometimes it just leads to some business practices that aren't super corporate. They're basically, you know, the blind leading the blind, which leads them to be doing some things that in a more official company that was founded by somebody with a business law degree, or I don't know. It just seems like maybe because these MLMs or Crumbl or whatever, maybe because they're founded by people who aren't as experienced and then they grow very quickly, it just leads to some more litigation than you might expect from a cookie company. That leads us to the Utah cookie wars, and I feel like when I first heard of this, I was like, how can you even copyright a chocolate chip cookie? I mean, you would think that cookies were impossible to copyright or to say, you know, I get the IP, the intellectual property on this. But let's jump into the cookie wars. Also, a lot of Utah cookies are really, really similar. So last week I showed my cookie from Swig, and it looks really similar to the Crumbl cookies. Usually Utah cookies are really massive. They have a dollop of some sort of frosting on the top. Often they're sugar cookies. They're a sugar cookie base with some stuff added on, and they're usually somewhat undercooked in my opinion, so they're kind of gooey at the center, which if I was making cookies at my house and they're kind of gooey in the center, I like that, but I don't necessarily like buying cookies from a business that are gooey in the center because it just feels different to buy something undercooked from a business that someone else cooked versus something that you made from ingredients in your own home. But anyways, cookies made in Utah are often more gooey in the center, some would say undercooked in the center, to give it that more moist flavor. So in May of 2022, Crumbl sued two cookie companies. One was the Dirty Dough and the other was Crave Cookie Company. And they said that their marketing materials were too similar, and they were also using rotating menus, and that their recipes were ripped off of Crumbl Cookie. So they basically sued these two companies and were like, this was our idea, you don't get to take it. In this article, the founder of Dirty Dough, who this guy is also Mormon, Bennett Maxwell, said, the thing that stuck out to me, Mr. Maxwell said, accusing Crumbl of being a bully, I was like, are you kidding me? They think they own the cookie with sprinkles? Which, so same thing I thought when I first heard of this. One part of the accusation seems to be that Crumbl said that there was a Crumbl employee who then went to Dirty Dough and then taught them all of the trade secrets, and so that's why they were bringing the lawsuit, is that this one employee had taken exactly what Crumbl was doing and then spilled the beans to Dirty Dough. I did think it was pretty funny that after Dirty Dough was sued by Crumbl, they had a billboard that said, cookies so good we're being sued. So that was a pretty clever. I also feel like Utah has a lot of billboard wars where they'll have all of the billboards will always be having conversations with each other, or it'll be like all these copycat companies will purchase billboards across from each other. And I don't know what is like, Utah has its own billboard culture, which I feel like could be its own video. Crumbl settled outside of court with both of these cookie companies, and so because they settled outside of court, we didn't get a ton of resolution as to who, you know, how they figured out how to settle this disagreement. But according to Crumbl's statement, as part of the case resolution, Dirty Dough returned the Crumbl information and has agreed to change certain cookie boxes in order to eliminate any potential confusion for customers. The remaining terms of the settlement agreement are confidential. So we don't, I feel like during the initial cookie wars back and forth, there were so many articles being written about this, and it's kind of a bummer when people settle outside of court because the public never gets to really know what happened. I also thought this quote was pretty hilarious. This is about Batch Baked Goods, which is another sweets company. It says, Batch Baked Goods insists their employees commit to keeping the recipe secret. My employees know the recipes like the back of their hand, Young said. They do sign an agreement that they can't take the recipes anywhere else. They will be sued. So Utah is land of the lawsuit. And thus concludes my deep dive into Crumbl Cookie and how Mormon culture made Crumbl the company that it is today. If you have your own thoughts about the Utah Cookie Wars or the Word of Wisdom, if you have any kooky stories, if you used to be Mormon, about how your family did or did not do certain things according to the Word of Wisdom, definitely please drop it below because I find those stories to be hilarious. Thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't yet, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and as always, I will see you all next week.